Hey everybody, wanted to do a quick deck tech on my first place winning deck from this year's Harry Potter TCG World Championship at Gen Con. As you can see, there was this nice trophy that I received, and all of the participants got this lovely playmat here. I have my starting character, or characters in this case, Fred and George, and we're going to talk about the deck that I played that uses them. So they have the ability to use one action instead of the usual two to put an adventure from your hand into play. And you can do it even if you already have one in play, discarding the old one. So both of those abilities are really powerful, and we'll talk about how they work. So as a Fred and George deck, obviously we're going to be running a lot of adventures. This deck's also running 11 Care of Magical Creatures and 10 Transfiguration lessons. But let's look at some of the adventures and what exactly we're doing with them. So for starters, we've got Escaping the Dursleys, which is your opponent can't use actions to play any cards except lesson cards. So they can use actions that they have available on the table already, such as things granted by a starting character or something like that. But other than that, the only actions they can really take are playing lessons and drawing cards. The way that they solve this is by discarding their hand. The reward that they get for that is searching for any one card, putting it in their hand, and then shuffling their deck. Now, depending on the deck that this is against, that reward can be a bit of a double-edged sword. However, leaving them with only one card in hand, they're probably not going to be able to do much for a little while, even if they do have a fair few lessons in play. The ideal opening hand has one of these Escaping the Dursleys, as well as one of these Caught by Snapes. Caught by Snape, as you can see here, does a very similar thing. Your opponent can't use actions to play any cards except lesson cards. But the way that they solve this one is much tougher. They have to use actions to play lesson cards 3 times. So that is an entire turn and a half spending actions to play lessons, and then the reward is that they can put any number of lesson cards from their hand into play. Most of the time, they're not going to be able to gain any benefit from that reward, since they're going to have been trying to draw into those 3 lessons that they needed to play. So Caught by Snape is extremely powerful, and while it has a similar effect to Escaping the Dursleys, it's ideal to chain them one right after the other. When they solve Escaping the Dursleys, they are probably not going to search for a lesson card, but something to try and affect the board. When you play Caught by Snape, they've now got no lessons in hand, and they've got to spend not only actions to play lessons in order to solve this, but also actions to draw those lessons in the first place. Also notably, these adventures kind of protect themselves. They can't play cards to get that solve adventures or get rid of adventures. So the only way to solve these for the most part is to actually do that to solve action, whatever that may be. Now, there are cards that can get around this. Professor McGonagall is one, but that's a once per game ability. So the player starting with Professor McGonagall may be able to solve your first adventure, but this deck runs so many that they're going to need some other way to deal with that. Now, a common card that I saw out of people's sideboards was Argus Filch. He can't be your starting character because he's not a witch or wizard, but he can use an action to discard an adventure from play. Now, note, he is not stopped by Caught by Snape or Escaping the Dursleys, because using his ability is not playing a card. So if he's already on the table, he can simply spend an action to solve any of your adventures. Except for Letters from No One. Letters from No One says your opponent may use actions only to draw cards. So they cannot do a single thing other than draw cards until Letters from No One is solved. They solve it by discarding 5 cards from their hand. So again, this is an excellent follow-up to Escaping the Dursleys, which is going to leave them with just 1 card in hand. Very often, they'll want to draw to more than 5 cards in hand before they solve this as well. because there may be cards in their hand that they need to actually advance their board state, which they may not have if they don't solve this. So their reward is that they get to draw 2 cards, which does help them refill their hand that they've mostly discarded at that point. But again, that's also essentially damage that you're dealing to them. My deck also ran 2 Through the Arches. This restricts your opponent from playing any spell cards. Against certain decks, that's going to be all their cards other than Lessons. So that's why there's only 2 of these in here, as well as 2 more that can come out of the sideboard depending on the match. But solving this is just brutal. It makes your opponent skip a total of 4 actions. So that is 2 complete turns in order to solve this. And the reward, putting an item from discard pile into hand, is often completely useless as well. Part of what makes cards like Caught by Snape and Through the Arch so powerful is the fact that Fred and George's ability can replace them. So if your opponent, for example, has spent 2 actions to play lesson cards with Caught by Snape out there, or if they've skipped 2 or 3 actions trying to solve Through the Arch, you can simply replace that with another copy of the same adventure or even a different adventure. So ideally, your opponent just isn't able to play very many cards as you kind of slowly build up your board state by playing lessons. A typical opening turn would just be to drop an adventure and drop 1 lesson. If they don't solve it, you try to drop a few more lessons. If they do solve it, you drop another lesson and another adventure, and so on and so forth. There is a 1 of Madame Pomfrey in here, just for some extra healing for those long grindy games. And there is a Hannah Abbott here, singleton copy as well, which I think I've said before is just a great card to include as a 1 of in any deck, because essentially you play her for 2 actions, and then she will turn 2 cards in your hand into the exact 2 cards that you need from your discard pile. So in the late game, this is very powerful. I had one game I played against an opponent in the tournament where I had 2 Letters from No One and a Hannah Abbott, and was able to play a Letters from No One. They solved it. I played another Letters from No One. They solved it. I played Hannah Abbott, used it to get back the 2 Letters from No One, played them again, and by that point I had drawn into yet another Letters from No One. So at that point the game is almost completely over. Having to discard your hand, or discard 5 cards from your hand 5 times is just brutal. I mean, it's almost half your deck in damage, and it's worse if you take the reward for doing it. And again, this was against an opponent who had a turn 1 Argus Filch on the board, meaning they should be able to easily deal with adventures, and yet they were not able to because they can't even use Filch's action that lets you discard. The Transfiguration lessons in there are for these cards. You've got Dobby's Disappearance, very powerful tempo card that lets you bounce any of your opponent's cards in play, return it to your hand, and then get 1 more action. Against decks that have Filch on the table, this is really powerful. They've probably spent 2 actions to play him. You get to bounce him back into their hand, costing them 2 more actions in order to play him again if they want to, and then you haven't even spent your action for the turn. That said, against certain decks, this is less powerful, and it did get sideboarded out fairly often for games where they didn't have a lot of threats to drop or didn't seem to have any trouble keeping lessons in play. So really just depended on the matchup for that. Picking on Neville lets you just choose one of your opponent's cards in play and discard it, and they can prevent that by choosing 2 in play and discarding them. So this is maybe the best card in the game. If you're playing Transfiguration, chances are you're playing 4 of these. There are very few matches where it isn't good. Really the only ones where it's not ideal are decks that run a lot of characters, where they welcome the ability to discard their used characters from play. So you have to be a little careful in those situations, but in a lot of cases, this card is just good at solving problems and keeping you ahead in terms of your tempo. Lost Notes solves any issues this deck has with items and can also be used just to punish decks that are playing lots of lesson types, but it's another card that would occasionally get sideboarded out. 5 is the highest lesson power cost that anything in this deck requires, and so against decks that attacked the amount of lessons that I had in play, it was often too difficult to get up to 5 if I didn't need to solve any items in particular. So as far as how we win this, other than making them just discard and redraw cards from adventures, we're running some creatures here. Of course, we're running 4 black bats. Probably the best creature in the game. Does immediate damage and just has a lot of very fast damage to your opponent. Sandstone Gargoyle is a little cheaper, and there were many cases where I couldn't afford to play a black bat, but I could afford to play a Sandstone Gargoyle. That difference of 1 lesson made a difference there. Only does 1 damage unless your opponent has no creatures in play, and then it does 2 more damage. So against creatureless decks, this is just doing 3 damage a turn. And even against decks that did run creatures, cards like Dobby's Disappearance, picking on Neville, can deal with those, and even the adventures, which prevent your opponent from playing those creatures. So very often Sandstone Gargoyle is hitting for 3 every turn. Trevor is some more anti-spell stuff. If they're trying to do lots of damage to me by spells, I can have Trevor absorb that. Also, when I play him, I get a lesson card from my discard pile into my hand. Trevor wasn't really a superstar in this deck, to be honest. It was so difficult for most of my opponents to play spells in the first place that there weren't a lot of incidents where he really absorbed much damage. It's still not a bad play because it's essentially a free card. You know, you put it in play, you get to pick up a lesson out of your discard pile, and so he doesn't really take up any space in your hand if you want to think about it that way. And then finally, I ran 1 Marble Gargoyle, also at the top end. So there are 3 cards in this deck before sideboarding that have 5 power, and it's the 2 Lost Notes, as well as this 1 Marble Gargoyle, which does up to 5 damage against those creatureless decks. So I have 1 more Marble Gargoyle in the sideboard for decks that were trying to play a lot of spells, not very many creatures, but also weren't really trying to restrict the amount of lessons that I played. These could be very powerful, but again, it was another card that would sometimes get sideboarded out against decks that aggressively went after my lesson development. So, and then finally, we've got Giant Tarantula. When you have a creature lesson in play, you can play Giant Tarantula. You will lose the creature lesson from play, but that is the only requirement. You need no more power than 1, and it will do 2 damage a turn. This is a pretty reasonable turn 1 play, though ideally you'd get an adventure out there to kind of protect it at first. There are only 2 of these because that discarding a creature lesson can come back to bite you, and it did sometimes. This was another card that would often get sideboarded out against decks that attacked lessons just because it was really difficult to always have that creature lesson that you needed. Though obviously a Giant Tarantula into a Trevor sort of makes up for that, as you can immediately recover the creature lesson that you put in your discard pile. So we're also going to talk about the sideboard. So, as already mentioned, 2 more copies of Through the Arch are in the sideboard, as well as 1 more copy of Marble Gargoyle. These would come in against, in the case of Through the Arch, would probably get subbed out for things like Lost Notes, and would come in against decks that play all or mostly spells. Marble Gargoyle could also come in those cases, but not against decks that do a lot of lesson control, because staying at 5 lessons to always be able to play it was difficult. Flying Motorbike, came in to choose adventures or locations in play and discard them. For the most part, I did not run into very many difficult adventures, but there certainly can be some that could create problems for this deck. So I would bring it in proactively sometimes against decks that ran anti-creature adventures and things like that, or against decks that relied on locations like Wand Shop to generate a lot of lesson power very quickly. Finally, the other 5 cards in here are just devoted to creature matches. Riding the Centaur is maybe the best adventure at preventing creature damage because it just prevents all damage that is done to you, and your opponent has to choose 4 cards in play and return them to hand in order to solve this. When they solve it, if they solve it, when they solve it, you've still got some really good options as follow-ups there. For starters, if your opponent has a lot of cards in hand, you can then drop adventures that make them discard their hand in order to solve it, like escaping the Dursleys. So all of those cards that get put back in their hand may not ever even hit the table again. Combined with cards like Dobby's Disappearance that bounce lots of cards into their hand, this is not necessarily a good thing for them. Raven to Writing Desk was just as a one of. If your opponent has 2 or more creatures in play, choose one of them and discard this. All you need is a single Transfiguration lesson out there, and you can get rid of even the most powerful creatures out there. I did run into a deck that was really good at putting lots and lots of powerful creatures out there early, as well as trying to slow my development down, so these cards were crucial in being able to win that match. As a side note, if your opponent brings in Riding the Centaur against you, and so your creature damage is being prevented, your ability to choose 4 of your cards in play and return them to hand can actually be a blessing in disguise. Yes, you will probably have to bounce some of your lessons and maybe some creatures from play that you have in order to solve this, but you may also be able to bounce a card like Caught by Snape at the point that your opponent has already spent 2 actions of their 3 trying to solve it. And then not only do you get to solve Riding the Centaur, but you get to replay Caught by Snape. So in either case, Riding the Centaur was not so much of a problem for this deck. Bear in mind as well, a lot of the adventures that I put out there prevent them from spending actions to play adventures. Most importantly, even if your opponent is got a lot of creatures out there and they've got an Argus Filch out there that you can't deal with, you can still spend a single action to play Riding the Centaur on your turn, and then at the start of their turn, when their creatures deal damage, that's before they're going to be able to take any actions to discard Riding the Centaur, which means that you'll at least prevent 1 turn's worth of damage. This did come up fairly often, where I had a couple Riding the Centaurs in hand and just was able to play them, trading actions with my opponent who had an Argus Filch in play. I spend an action to play it, they spend an action to get rid of it. But if we do that every turn, the creatures will never deal damage to me unless they do damage when they come into play. So that was the deck. The tournament had 16 competitors at it. We had 4 rounds of Swiss, where I did go 4-0. I lost 2 games in that, so I had a 2-0 match, and then a 2-1 match, and then a 2-0 match, and then 2-1 match. One of the game losses was to an all character deck, which was a really fun deck to play against. Probably the closest match for sure. And the other deck was against a deck that was very, very heavy on creature damage. So I actually lost the first game of that match, brought in all these Riding the Centaurs, Raven to Writing Desk, things like that, and it became really difficult for my opponent to win matches after that. In a game, in a format where sideboarding was not allowed, I would definitely consider running some Riding the Centaurs in the main deck, possibly replacing things like Through the Arch, because the deck is so strong against spells already. That would probably be the way I would go there. In the finals, we had the semifinals and the finals. I went 2-0 in the first game and then 2-1 in the final against a deck that had the ability to put lots and lots of big creatures out on the board, and ended up in second place, of course. So anyway, that is my Gen Con Harry Potter experience, as well as a deck tech on the Fred and George deck. So thanks for watching.